everybody, and thanks for being awake and alive in this beautiful space on such a sunshine morning and ready to listen to such a complicated animal as this convention to protect and promote the diversity of cultural expressions. But I really very great and thankful to the organizers of having the courage to show us at the beginning of this exciting conference into the 10th anniversary celebration, which is actually this year indeed, as on the 20th October 2005, this new instrument in cultural law was voted after a rather dramatic day. Those of you who have ever seen images of these days, you had all the 200 flags of the UN around and people waving their country flags all day long to get that through. And why was it so challenging and so complicated? And where do we stand today in terms of implementing it? Actually, we are in the lucky situation already today, even after only 10 years, one might say, to have a whole implementation library at our disposal. Almost 100 countries who have participated in one way or the other, implementing either new ideas in public policies or NGOs launching projects in the content of the convention, or countries wanting to improve their cultural governance. So all this is somewhere out there, but the idea is to use these 20 minutes to bring that a bit closer to our brains and hearts and minds, and then have a minimum of 15 minutes of debate and exchange. As always with stories, it's important to remember the beginning. Why do we have at all a piece of international legislation in the field of arts and culture? One might think this is a bizarre thing, because legal framing is one level and artistic creation is a very different level. So let me remind you quickly that 2015 does also mark the 70th anniversary of both the United Nations system and UNESCO proper. So what we know today as international law, with really important pieces like the Rights of the Child Convention, like the anti-landmine ban, like the Climate Convention, biological diversity, are all relatively new efforts to safeguard somehow the public good. And for a very long time in the culture field, mainly heritage issues and wartime issues were addressed. So this is really if you monitor like the decades of our parents and grandparents, this is how the field was approached. And why came the idea, emerged the idea to really see the need to address contemporary artistic creation, curating, co-production, all the things you are doing in your professional life. And there, your neighbors in Stockholm, 1998, the big conference on culture and development really was a momentum to midwife this process for two very precise reasons. This was the beginning point with the General Agreement on Trades and Services, just adopted in 1995, and that awareness was growing both among the professionals and the public administrators, that with the aim to deliberalize many of the fields in our trade system, there definitely was a risk to hinder the diversity of cultural expressions when treating cultural services, artistic products, just as any other product, as any other commodity. So this really was the starting point, because of first problematic experience, especially in the Canadian-US context through the NAFTA agreement, And at the same time, I would say there was a clear presensing of the enormous potential of artistic creation, what later became dubbed as the creative economy. So this discourse was just starting. But I think there was a clear presensing, and we do know the figures by now, that in very many countries around the globe, the arts and culture sector contributes up to 2.5, sometimes even 3, 4% of the gross domestic product. So there was a clear understanding we should take care of this sector in a very different way, recognizing its specificities and its very specific ecosystem. And this, Niels, is also one of the reasons why indeed it is a complex text. It's a short one, 15 pages, no more, but it takes you around the globe in 3 seconds. I was tempted to bombard you with 111 slides and take you on a trip around the globe, because there are many, many beautiful implementation examples. But I decided against, because I think the more useful thing would be to make your voice heard. Because why is this convention so special? Because in addition to 140 countries out of 200, which is a really substantial number, all EU member states, all OECD countries with the exception of United States and Japan, many, many emerging powers like Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, Indonesia, China, India are in this together. And so are roughly estimated 600 cultural organizations and networks from different parts of the world, including Europe, who are working on making this instrument work. So allow me one phrase about international law. What is the difference if politically such a grouping of country goes for a convention? It's uttered and inscribed political will to be specifically with and for this sector over time, over decades. And this is a big difference to many action programs you might know, even a bold action plan like the Millennium Development Goals, which took a 15 years horizons, and we are in the moment of renegotiating the Sustainable Development Goals this year, which have the horizon 2030. But please remember, the biggest known instrument of UNESCO, the World Heritage Convention, has already been around for more than 45 years. So the real point is how to build knowledge communities, how to build cultural action communities over time, who really also take these instruments as their own and appropriate that as a tool in their own professional and civic life. And there, if you are willing to take 1 minute to build the knowledge scape in this room together, it's not a school test, but of course my curiosity would be, who of you has had a look, has heard about this convention in one way or the other? So if you would be willing to raise your hand, that's already quite a critical mass. And maybe second also, who has taken the time to maybe even read the text? That's a tougher one, isn't it? Yeah, still some courageous people are not afraid of legal language. And lastly, as I said, there is a beautiful electronic library on all the implementation avenue, which is on UNESCO.org portal under the creativity slash. So has any of you, by coincidence, surfing through cyberspace, run into this beauty already? So if you have, raise your hand. If not, this is an invitation. Because, as was said, I think our European countries, and especially also the Nordic countries, with your rich tradition in public policies, the first approach to this convention was, do we need to do anything at all? Aren't we champions in cultural policies anyway, with our great track record in human development, in education, in well-being? So here The interesting point is, and this is why I took, Rike kindly copied a little bit this brief handout, which really gives you a 10-second approach to this beautiful convention. It has 8 dimensions. You know that the rainbow does have 7 colors, but this is the Rainbow Plus convention. Why? Because if we are approaching this field, and this is very much the political objective with this instrument, to both empower countries from within to choose their best option, to strengthen the arts and culture sector, while also leveling the playing field. Because if you look, and this is an arts and globalization conference which brings us together, so if you look into the data, how on a global level we exchange artistic products, cultural performances, music, films, whatever, you see, of course, on one hand, very great unevenness. It's still a handful of countries mainly dominating the large markets. On the other hand, we also do see many more cultural expressions coming into our shared public spaces. So the organizers here are the urban art space. So we are in a transition world. And this is why this roadmap, which this UNESCO convention very much is, gives you at least 8 pointers. This is, of course, a bold effort to put it on one page, which is a challenge as such. But why is it useful to have to run very quickly through this small piece of paper? Because the starting point, and this is really important and very often not understood, the starting point is the unlimited cultural self-determination on the basis of human rights. And with the many parties to this convention, which also have mixed records in terms of human rights, you can imagine that this is really a very important field of action, especially for artists, for cultural professionals, and for all sorts of solidarity networks. And one precise example, also powered by Norwegian funding, is Arts Watch Africa, a very active action network through Arterial, which has come into being in the context of this convention. So first point, access and participate in cultural freedom is a big objective. We don't know whether it will be achieved by 2020, 2030, 2050, or maybe in the 22nd century, but this is what it is as the baseline for this cooperation platform. The second one, and this really was the political push, recognizing the dual nature of cultural goods and services as being, of course, both commodities for trade. Artists do want to live well from their work. So book trading has been existing for centuries. Musicians have always roamed freely. Artistic productions throughout Europe traveled from country to country and much beyond. So this goes without saying. However, as said, in a context of today, one would say both digitization and liberalization, there is a very serious point here, and we see in the European context the current negotiation with the United States on a trade and investment transatlantic partnership touches upon this issue very, very strongly. And this is also true for other parts of the world where sub-regions organize in economic terms and try to make their way to find a balance between the public sphere and the market sphere. Third element, the right to cultural policy, that you might find surprising because it almost goes without saying in a country like this one and most of our European countries. However, this is a clear reflection of the reason why this convention came into being. And we do have this debate very much, even in the European context, discussing such an instrument as a litigation mechanism, where investors might claim that cultural public policies are undue bias of competition possibilities. Though this is a really important point, and you also see, if you look into the implementation library at UNESCO.org creativity, you do see, of course, that very important countries like Brazil, like Nigeria, like large states really use this convention platform to really develop long-term cultural policy strategies, while they might have had good methods to like quota systems in television or artistic support schemes. But this really also has already now, only 10 years after the vote, brought a big push for countries to think large, to really consider the ecosystem of the cultural and arts sector. And here you go, participation of civil society, this is us and many others. I hope each of you speaks to a minimum of 10 people after this conference, so this makes already 2,000 of us in this room. And this is important. It's not necessarily new in the UN arena, as over the whole 1990s and Copenhagen hosted the World Social Development Summit exactly 20 years ago as well. So of course this was a moment when it became increasingly clear that in order to come up with sustainable development strategies, you need to include many voices. But it's specific in the culture context. This is really the first and only instrument which spells it out so clear and loud. Without civil society bringing their knowledge, their commitment, their energy, and their stamina to this field, not much can be achieved, because the role of government should be to be enabler, but not to be commander in this field. So touchy issue, and also in for the long haul. International cooperation is really the heart of the matter. As I said already, if you analyze data, and there is of course a lot of detail, I didn't want to throw many figures on you, but UNESCO Institute of Statistics has really done a beautiful job. For instance, monitoring the production of feature film around the globe. Or you have data how the music industry has developed over the last 20 and 30 years in all our continents. So you see that we are together entering, and Rikke said it already, we are in a transformation stage. So I would also say it's no longer only about intercultural dialogue. We are already in the middle of co-production, co-curating, co-dissemination. And here this convention really has a strong platform to make, first of all, to exchange good ways, how to do that in a fair culture orientation, how to do it to mutual benefit, ideally win-win-win-win constellations. And of course, devil is very much in the detail here, because without issues like mobility for cultural professionals and artists, without issues like custom, fiscal issues, access to prominent fairs, to markets, to biennials. So this is really also a very interesting field of action for your own professional context, because this does not only mean to wait what government might do or not. I give you one example from my own home turf, Berlinale, one of the big film rendezvous around the year. It was really through the professional community itself that people said we can use such a moment much better than only selling licenses. Let's transform Berlinale into a co-production space. So World Cinema Fund was created to do that, exactly that, 10 years ago. 100 films have been co-produced ever since and co-distributed, and also to open Talent Campus to also use that as a learning and sharing space. And this model has inspired Durban Film Festival, which reciprocated it. So this is the new quality beyond intercultural dialogue only, which this convention invites us to think ahead of the curve and develop much more innovatively in the years to come. Integration of culture in sustainable development, and here Denmark has always been admired by many of us as a forerunner in this work, also through the Center of Culture and Development, through the recently adopted strategy of 2013, but this is not yet common sense in many of our countries, because sustainable development is at least as complex as diversity of cultural expression. So you marry two complexities and you get, you need a lot of conversation for people to become familiar with that. And last, and here you have a little bit the technicalities, information sharing is really the key modality. And this is probably also the reason why it's not very easy to see the Eiffel Tower of this convention. If you go for nominating a World Heritage Site, a country is very proud, their press releases, when we do that in Germany, you get minimum 1,000 press coverage. This convention works in a way to make the invisible grammar of our sector accessible and visible. So this is something for marathon runners like me and others who are not afraid of those 42 kilometers, because you do not see easily at first sight if I change a tax regulation. For instance, to halve the VAT on cultural products, which would be a fantastic boost for the sector. These are very often small and rather odd technical details, neither sexy nor multicolor XXL size, but very important. So, for instance, Canada has introduced a cultural professional visa, which is exactly one of the interesting action strategies one might use. The EU countries are almost in the final stage of revising the Schengen Code, and the whole experience of the artistic field was solicited very, very actively, exactly for the same reason. Though this information sharing, while it might sound something for academics, for scholars who have lots of time of browsing through all this material, is a really very interesting thing. I had the privilege to read through the 70 periodic reports already shared by many, many of the signatory parties, and there is a written contribution to this conference for those of you who would like to see more details, because the interesting conclusion is that many countries really start addressing the cultural value chain from creation to production to distribution, dissemination, participation of audiences in a very holistic way. So this understanding that we somehow are part of an ecosystem in cultural terms is definitely developing as we go along. And the last point on this sheet, you find the issue of equality with other international treaties. And this points, of course, to the political field. A text is never a text. A rose is a rose or it's a rose, but a convention is not a text, a text, a text. It's really a political process behind, where especially when you grasp how it was negotiated, and I had both the pleasure and the burden to contribute to writing a legal commentary on this one. This is a 800 pages screen book, extremely frightening, yeah. But then you realize of course, how strong the concerns were, especially of those countries who are very strong in cultural trade, to lose space by subscribing this instrument. This is one of the reasons why Japan is still not coming over the bridge. Our colleagues of the Japanese UNESCO Commission are really doing a lot of constant advocacy work, and of course it would be extremely interesting to bring Japan on board. Australia had similar reticences, but after elections and a different government, it joined the group of parties. So here you see that this is really, why is it so interesting? Because it's so challenging. But to make a long story short, what is interesting now is where to go from here. So the last 2.5 minutes, there are two things in mind. As I said, why a convention to create a cooperation platform for the long term? So like people who analyze energy scenarios or who analyze biological diversity, we really should not be afraid of thinking what might be the diversity of cultural expressions 2030, 2040, 2050. And we do not know, because none of us probably had predicted the role and place of digitization for restructuring our field 10 and 20 years ago. But this is the horizon, and a short-term rendezvous not to be missed, please, because all our countries will be delivering their second periodic reports in spring 2016. So almost 9 months, a good pregnancy from now. And their consultation with civil society is a must. The parties were willing to subscribe. Yes, we want to bring the voice of the professionals on board. So whatever your possibility of action is, think about it to really contribute to this process, because it will make this instrument more meaningful, more rich, and more lively over time. Because in addition to what governments can and should do in terms of public policies, what we do as cultural professionals, and there are many good examples from the union field, from the musicians who also have a peer-to-peer working process. So there is a lot of space which needs to be used and needs to be analyzed, and the floor is open for debate exactly for this reason. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christine. One question immediately that kind of occurs to me is the experience that we have had working with the implementation of the UNESCO Convention, that to some extent, between the ears, as a kind of mindset, it does work.
Yeah.
But the translation of the mindset into a bureaucratic structure, into a bureaucratic practice.
Beast.
Exactly, where you kind of get it into the result agreements between the ministries and the institutions receiving, the taxpayers' money through their annual funding. That seems to be quite difficult. It seems to be difficult to translate the traditional modernistic kind of semi-nationalistic cultural approach that we have had and twist it into a much more contemporary, much more global and much more inclusive policy. Could you just evolve a bit your thoughts about that?
With pleasure. Remember, beauty and the beast. That's exactly the point, because that's why I said a text is not a text. We have this interesting challenge of working with public authorities. I speak briefly, if you allow. In my role in Germany, we at the Commission are the national contact point for this convention. So we saw exactly when drafting the first periodic report how difficult it was and almost impossible to make Ministry of Development Cooperation understand that they should speak to their cultural colleagues and vice versa, because on the level of Länder, nobody understood either. Yeah? So as I say, my perception is we are really in the middle of a transformation state because the professionals are on the move, if they can, if they have access and if they have knowledge. So there are some interesting examples which we also can draw from this implementation library. So Austria obviously had succeeded in pulling together an interministerial working group which developed this readiness to understand that there might be more common ground than expected. But I do know it has been difficult in all countries. Our Brazilian colleague Giselle Dupin just said the same thing. Although they did admirable things, especially bringing in very important ministries like labor, social affairs, if you think about employment creation for young people, but also social contexts of artists. So I think, like always in real political life, the art is to be neither cynical nor frustrated, but just take it as it is. We had rather good experiences in working with parliament. So parliamentarians really can very often be of help, because if they ask questions to governments, government needs to reply. It's more difficult when we, from the professional field, enter. But I do think, especially for our European context, countries are in between. And especially big ones like us, the German German elephant, with a fantastic networks like Goethe institutes around the globe, there is a tendency to think we can do alone. Yeah? And in this sense, I think it's an interesting year, because also on the European level, with this conversation, what to do with our neighborhood policy, how to develop cultural action in European foreign policy. There is a second conversation which maybe opens the door. But I don't expect ministries to be enthusiastic and knock on the doors in the very short run.
Do you know the the Ministry of Norway, the Cultural Ministry of Norway?
Yeah.
In Norway they had a year of cultural diversity in 2008, and in 2008 that year was transforming into a kind of, you didn't say it, but Scandinavian excellence in the way that it was turned into a year of sustainability and creating inclusive strategies. But at the very same time, it kind of confirmed the slowness of our own systems. And I'm looking out to you, because that slowness of our own systems is, the routines, the set of rules that we are all governed by. And what they did was they introduced the term globalism. Think globally, act locally. In the sense that to change politics and law is quite a difficult way to enter, and it will probably have to be entered over time. But at the very same time, they said, well, if the institutions, if people like you could kind of stimulate that process by, in your own practice, in your own organizations, as artists or as institutions, kind of do take care of that process already before the legislation is ready, something could actually happen. And it's quite interesting, because that was 7 years ago. And it has changed, but it has kind of changed the composition in the cities, in the multicultural areas like Oslo, Drammen, Bergen, but not necessarily in the composition all over the country. What do you think about that? How can you get around that kind of slowliness built into the system?
Chi va piano va lontano, say the Italians. So those who walk slowly get far. I think it's in the very nature that public administration is mostly resistant to change unless citizens ask for it. And there we have a mixed picture also in our European societies. You have like rightist populist reaction to the same development, and you have efforts to move ahead and to push. So I do think it's a multi-actor game. So also the moment big countries from the global south articulate them more clearly, also in dialogue with our governments, and to share what they are doing of taking care of their own creative system, this will also help. And I'm not pessimistic. Norway had one of the few countries who reported back on this 2005 convention also the very important legislative change they did on assuring media diversity, including through monitoring ownership in the media sector. So and this helps to have this as part of the implementation library. So it helps other countries to say, okay, this is doable, so why not us? But it needs an understanding how politics works, and it's never a quick fix, unfortunately. But there might be questions from.
Yeah, exactly. Any questions for Christine? Yes. We have a question down here to the left. Yeah. Just one question. Just one question.
Micro?
No? A microphone?
Hello. I have a question regarding the change of the laws and policy that you mentioned before, and the collaboration with the government. And when it comes to the local context, like in Denmark, for example, if there is a law to be changed, like let's say now we talk about interculture and we talk about art, and in a Danish context we have the museums who are in their collections having very, very few, if none, intercultural artists represented. So my question is, who is to take the collaboration locally when it comes to changing of the laws? And you talk about collaboration with the government, for example. So UNESCO is working on one level, as I understand, and I've been reading this paper as well. Now locally, who is taking the ball and who is playing with UNESCO? Is it your center, Nils, or is it another organization that is actually collaborating with UNESCO in changing the laws in the government here in this country in order to change the art and culture scene to be more inclusive when it comes to interculture?
Yeah. It's in very many countries that the local government and municipalities are the most important drivers in the cultural infrastructure. It's also the situation in our countries, but you can see that in many Latin American countries. So their city-to-city networking is extremely important. I do know that my city, Cologne, did exactly that. They did like a radiography on the cultural offer, the way the important cultural spaces in the city incorporate or not diversity of cultural expressions. So these initiatives need to be taken locally, but you have networks like, of course, the United City and local government structures, which is also UNESCO's most important partner, but you also have something like a Creative Cities network. So there are different ways of really teaming up, like professional organizations do, and this is very important because clearly UN system is always national government, but you can also help your national government to have good insights if cities articulate evidence-based and also action-oriented proposals. So just 2 months ago, UCL convened the Culture 21 Action Summit in Bilbao, because there is a grouping of cities from many different continents, mainly middle-sized cities, who are getting also together like a knowledge community to share experience. So I really would recommend to check that one out, but it's very important not to wait until some government signal comes from above. It needs to move from the different angles, and these stakeholders are very relevant to the cultural field, especially, well, in federal states like Canada, Brazil, and many others. It's also the state level which has a lot of legal and financial say.
Just to add to that, I would say that in Scandinavia, for instance, we see similar movements in the regions of Western Gothia and Skåne in Sweden. Copenhagen itself has done a lot of things on intercultural dimensions, inclusion strategies, the whole Via Alle Københavner, which is a program, we're all Copenhageners, addressing the idea of identity being something different than based on nationality, was a strategy launched almost 10 years ago. So the cities do carry out already as we go, and there is this network, the Creative Cities Network, where Copenhagen is also part of the Intercultural City Network under the Council of Europe program. It's a 21 city program. So there are a number of programs where we are already seeing it happen. Unfortunately, due to time and time schedule, we will have to move on. So, Christine, thank you very much. A warm hand for Christine Merkel.
Well, thank you for your readiness to listen
and to you guys, please remember this was an invitation, so let's keep the ideas floating, and you're more than welcome to fill in the small clouds, and then we will actually post the small cloud somewhere in the hall during these 3 days to see what kind of reflections, ideas and wishes that we could all come up with.